One last type of procedural textures that we're going to look at is process textures. Now, process textures are something of a hybrid texture where they don't necessarily do something on their own, although some of them do, but usually they're best when used in conjunction with other textures, either procedural textures, which we already looked at and which we'll look at more in this lesson, and also with image-based textures. They can work with any of them. Now, process textures can use either underlying textures or the geometry of an existing object in order to add another level of variation to the surface of an object. So let's start here with this first sphere, and we're going to look at the basic process textures. So those can be found here under Add Layer and Processing. So you can see we have a number of different things here, but it's not really too much, so we're going to go over at least lightly just about everything in here. So there is a constant texture, which will just place a single value over the surface of an object, and that can be applied to any heading. So it can be for the color, the reflectivity, the roughness. I can go into any of those different categories. There's a gradient, which can give you a range of values or a range of colors, and that can be based on a lot of different things, which again we'll look at here in a moment. There's an occlusion texture, which uses the geometry of an object to help add the variation that we're going to be looking for. There is a process texture, which is very much like an adjustment layer that allows you to play with the underlying values of something that's already existing. There's a tension texture, which we're not going to look at in this lesson because it largely has to do with surfaces that are deforming. And as surfaces deform, the polygons and the underlying structure of a model will deform along with it, and so the tension is going to be based on the amount of stretch or squash that exists on your object. There is a variation texture, which can be used with anything like particles or replicators, where you have a large number of items in order to be able to add some color variation to those objects. Say, for example, if you have a forest full of trees, you could use the variation texture to adjust so that you have varying shades of green, or if you want to change it to fall time, you could have different tones of yellows and browns and reds on the tree leaves in order to give that variation that you're looking for. And then the final one here is a weight map texture, and a weight map texture is based off of a weight map, which is basically a vertex based attachment or assignment of different values. So you can take values and assign different weights. Now this is going to be much like when we were looking at modeling and using the weight on subdivision surface models. You can add other weight maps, and you can have as many weight maps as you would like on an object, and then those weight maps can then be tied into different texture values. So all of these things can give you a nice amount of variation. Let's start here by looking at a constant texture. And when I drop this in, you can see that it comes in as diffuse color, and if we select it here, we can see that we have a color, and really that's it. So with a constant color, you can take and drive the color of your object, and this is much like how you would drive the color just based off of the material color itself. However, this allows you to break out that value, and then you can have it on its own layer essentially. So you can use this along with blending modes. So if you have either a color or a texture underneath, you can apply this to kind of overlay that surface in any way that you might want to with blending modes. But then you can also take this and you can duplicate it or create instances and apply them to other objects, so that you can then go in and adjust one of these values and it will adjust a bunch of different materials together. All right, so that is a constant layer. So let's go ahead and go to the next one here, and this one already has some texture on it. All right, so this has a cellular texture, and then you can see here that I have a process layer added onto it. Now this process is set to diffuse color, just like the cellular texture is, and so if I turn this on, now at first nothing's going to happen because it's not really doing anything. Now process textures can be thought of kind of like an adjustment layer, so they will take anything underneath them in that same effect category, so diffuse color in this case, and then you can adjust the bias and the gain, the hue, saturation, and value. So if I adjust, say, the bias one way or the other, you can see it's going to lean the texture more towards one of the underlying values. So now I'm going almost all towards the cell color, and then if I go up higher, I'm going almost all towards the filler color. Okay, so let's take that back down. The gain is essentially our contrast. So you can see right now we have a little bit of kind of softness in between. If I turn the gain up, you can see it gets very, very hard. And if I turn the gain down, it starts to just kind of be a little bit more bland. All right, so moving on, we have the more useful part of this, because you usually have bias and gain within individual texture layers. Just a side note, the more powerful part in here is going to be the hue, saturation, and value. So again, you could take multiple objects and use the same cellular texture on a dozen different objects, and then you could go in and manually have a little bit of color adjustment. This would be much like using the variation texture that I talked about, where you would set it to replicators or particles so that you would have some automatic variation happening. This now gives you some manual variation. So say you have 3 different cars and they all have a stylized paint job. You could use this variation texture and apply it to 3 separate materials and just give a little bit of variation without having to change all of the different texture layers. For example, I could take the hue and adjust it. So let's pull the hue a little this way, and you can see it gets more green, and then we'll eventually get around to being more blue. If I go the other direction, it will get more purple, and then more red, and eventually work its way around to blue as well. Okay, so we have control over the hue there. Also, we can adjust the saturation. You can see we can ramp it up and get more saturation, turn it down and get less saturation, and then value is essentially just the brightness. Turning it up, we get a brighter surface. Turning it down, we get a darker surface. So this is a good way to be able to take some work that you've already done and be able to just simply adjust it without a lot of extra work. It's just a single layer that allows you to go in and adjust those values. All right, so moving on, let's go up to camera 3 here. All right, so another thing that we have the option for here is, if we go into processing, is a gradient layer. So I'm going to put a gradient layer on here, and at first nothing's going to happen because my gradient doesn't have any values in it that are populating it right now. You can see right now that my input parameter is based off of incidence, and this is going to be the angle that a surface is facing relative to our camera. So facing the camera, let's go ahead and click on Edit Gradient. Facing the camera is going to be one color, which is what we have at 0. And at 100%, that's going to be that glancing angle where it's facing 90 degrees away from us. So if I put in another stop right here, and I select this and make it black, you can see that now at the edges, this is going to black. All right, so you can go in here at any point and you can add in additional stops. So you can make this as complex as you want, and you can add in different colors. So let's kind of adjust this a little bit just to make something a little bit more interesting here. There you go. You can see you can go and make these changes that will go across the surface of an object. And now as we move the object or we move the camera, these are going to adapt and move along with the camera. So you could use this to give kind of an iridescent effect. You could use this to modulate just about anything. If you want to manually modulate the roughness of a surface, or the reflectivity of a surface based on the angle, you can do that. If you want to take and decrease your transparency as you get towards that glancing angle, some of that will be handled by the shader itself, by the material, but you can go in and manually have some control over that. So perhaps the transparency of an object falls off significantly as you get to more of that not directly facing angle. You could create something like the effect of privacy glass on a computer screen, where if you're facing directly on, it's normally viewed, and as soon as you get a little bit of an off angle, it tints it to black. So you could do all sorts of really interesting things with the gradient texture, and it's something that you'll use relatively frequently as you get into more in-depth shading work. All right, so moving on here, we're going to do a number of things here on this last sphere because it already has a texture set up on it. I've got a plate texture that has plates and peel and rivets all just set up on here. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of different things here. And the first thing that we're going to look at is the occlusion shader. And what the occlusion shader does is, let's go ahead and turn this on. Right now it's going to override my diffuse color, so it's going to be a little bit easier to see. But what the occlusion shader does is it takes the proximity of geometry to itself or to other objects, and it uses that proximity to determine the different use of colors. So in this case, in areas where we have more kind of hidden away, tucked away areas that are occluded, that's the occlusion means, that are more occluded from the air around it or the ambience around it, those areas are going to be darker and they're going to get this color 1. Areas that are just more out in the open, like these convex areas, those are going to get the color value 2. So if I take this and let's go ahead and just put something that's a little bit easier to see on here. Let's say I put red on there. You can see now that we're getting in these little gap areas, we're going to start to get some red. Now I can increase the occlusion distance or decrease it to make it a little bit tighter, and we're just going to get more or less of that color in there. You can kind of see it a little bit more up there. Now there are several different types of occlusion, and I'm going to turn this down to black again, and this is the uniform occlusion type, which is kind of just your default ambient occlusion. It's going to take the occlusion based off of what is surrounding it, and basically if you were to take light coming from all angles and shine it in at the surface, areas that are going to be hidden more from that light are going to be occluded. So that's the uniform occlusion. Now you also have some interesting ones here. So the up occlusion, if we look here, you'll see this is going to give us some kind of streaks going downwards. So this is great for giving the look of wear or kind of dripping off of a surface or something like that. You can see little bits of that. Also kind of similar to that is the down slope. This one is based off of the actual angle of it relative to just normal XYZ space. So you can see again we kind of get these little kind of drippiness coming off of the surface depending on its facing angle. We have a reflection one, which is kind of based off of your current view, and it will take whenever the surface is reflecting itself or would reflect itself based off of your view, it will get the color value 1, and otherwise if it wouldn't reflect itself, it will get the color value 2. Now the ones that I use fairly heavily and that are pretty easy to see as well are going to be concavity, convexity, and then concavity and convexity. So concavity is going to be concave areas, so it's areas that are shadowed. And this is in a lot of ways very similar to the default one, the uniform one, but it's a little bit heavier. So you can see I'm getting a lot more in these little creases. It's definitely highlighting things a lot more. Convexity is the kind of inverse of that, so it's going to be areas that are not concave but are more jutting out. So we can see we're getting this on the corners, the edges. So right now they're fairly close together because these plates aren't super deep, but you can see it's kind of running along the corners here. And then you can also turn it on convexity and concavity if you want, so that you're getting the recessed areas as well as the kind of more sharp corners. Okay, and the last two, and these two are not going to show up super well on this model, so I'm not going to go through them here, but the thickness is going to be just based on how far one polygon face is from its opposite side. So if you take something like this sphere, the sphere here, and then what's on the opposite side. Now with the sphere, the opposite side is almost always, except for the little bit of variation with these plates, is going to be the same distance away. These spheres I think are 1.5 meters, so it's all going to be uniform, so it won't show up. But if you think of something like a character, the character has a nose and it has ears. Those ears are going to be thinner, so the thickness value will get lighter in those thinner areas. The nose, same kind of thing, but in the middle of the head, where it has to go all the way to the other side of the head to get to the opposite side polygon, it's going to be a lot more like this sphere, so it's going to get the other value. So this can be used to kind of fake things like translucence, subsurface scattering, and that kind of thing. And then the last one is curvature, and this can be really helpful if you have objects that just have varying levels of flat and curved areas. It might show up a little bit on this model. Yeah, it shows up a little bit, but you can see basically wherever the area is more curved, which is going to be kind of like at these corners, you get the one value, and then where the area is more flat, you get the other value. But since everything on here is kind of curved, we don't really get this color value too much because there's really nothing straight here. It all has a little bit of curve because it's on a surface of a sphere, but the areas that are more curved, like at these corners, pick up that color value 1. Now, the cool thing about something like an ambient occlusion shader is if you're using it right here in just inside of your shader, you can just use it to add some accentuation. So I'm going to pick let's pick downslope here, which kind of gives us, like I said, kind of a little bit of kind of drips downwards. And let's increase the distance just a little bit. There you can see, so those pull down a little bit farther. And you can also increase something like variation, which is basically just a little bit of noise that you can add to the surface. I'm not going to add that now because it's going to be a little bit difficult to see how this is rough, but it just adds a little bit of a breakup to it so that it's not so smooth. But now if I take this occlusion layer and I set its blend mode to multiply, now you can see I'm going to get my normal underlying colors, but at the same time, I'm going to get a little bit of darkness kind of dripping down across the top. So this would be good to add to something like roughness. Areas where water is dripping across the stuff are going to be less reflective, so you're going to get higher roughness values, lower reflectivity. You can do all sorts of cool things with that. And so that does it for the process textures. You really get a lot of power in here between the gradients and the process texture and the ambient occlusion texture, and then the various kinds of variation textures. You can use these to add a lot of good subtle changes and shifts over either the surface of an individual object or to a multitude of objects, either manually or automatically, depending if you're using particles or replicators or just manual duplicates of your objects. They're a good way to help you build up a lot of different detail inside of your textures inside of Modo. So that does it for this one. Thanks, and I will see you in the next lesson.